foreseeable future. So the American Cetacean Society, I think as many of you know, is the oldest nonprofit dedicated to the protection of whales, dolphins, porpoises, and their habitat. And we do this through education, community engagement, and by awarding grants in support of marine biology science. So by being here, you are supporting our work, and again, thank you. So our talk tonight is Antarctica, Science and Policy on a Frozen Continent. But before we get started and I introduce our speaker, just a couple items. First, we are recording tonight's session, and so we will be posting it on our website and on our social media. And after our speaker has concluded, we will take questions from the chat box. So please do put your questions in the chat box as you have them, and we'll do our best to get them in the Q&A. And now I'm really excited to introduce our speaker, Deneb Karentz. And Dr. Karentz is a professor of biology and environmental science at the University of San Francisco. She's a marine biologist with expertise in plankton ecology, and she has over 30 years of field experience in Antarctica. Deneb is co-director of the National Science Foundation International Training Program in Antarctic Biology. She is the US delegate to the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research. She is an ex-officio member of the United States National Academies Polar Research Board, and she is a science advisor to the US Department of State for the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meetings. So I know we are going to learn a whole lot about this amazing continent of Antarctica. And also I think we're going to learn why we really should care about it if we don't already. So with that, I am going to hand it over to you, Deneb, and thank you so much again for being here with us this evening.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan, for the introduction. And I also want to thank Susan for inviting me to come and speak tonight. Antarctica is a really favorite topic of mine, so I'm very much looking forward to sharing some of the things that I know about it with you. So the talk is it's fairly short considering how much stuff there is to say about the Antarctic, but I'm going to try to give you an overview of science and policy in Antarctica. And to start with, I want to make sure everybody knows where we're talking about. So here's a really nice graphic from NASA that shows the Antarctic continent covered with ice, and you can also see the sea ice surrounding the continent that forms over the Southern Ocean. I also wanted to start out by making sure that everybody understood the distinction between the Arctic and the Antarctic. So the Arctic is an ocean covered with ice, and the Antarctic is a continent covered with ice. And one of the other big differences between the two is that there are people that live in the Arctic on a permanent basis, but that's not true for Antarctica. The people that go to the Antarctic are scientists, support staff that are providing logistics for science, and tourists. And so these are people that go to the Antarctic and then go home. So that's another big difference between the two. And then I also wanted to emphasize that polar bears are in the Arctic and penguins are in the Antarctic. And never the two shall meet unless you go to a zoo somewhere else. So some statistics about the Antarctic. And I should also mention that I know some of you have been to the Antarctic. Some of you are interested in Antarctica and probably have read about it. And others of you may not know anything at all about Antarctica. And so it was really kind of a challenge not knowing the audience to know how to put this talk together. So hopefully even those of you who know a lot about Antarctica might learn a little bit as you listen to my presentation. So Antarctica is the 5th largest continent of 7. It has an area of more than 5 million square miles, and you can see in the center below a map of the, or an image of the United States superimposed on top of Antarctica to give you a sense of its size. Most of the continent is covered with ice. The ice-free zones are about 3% of the total area. And those are all mostly in coastal areas. And then there's an area referred to as the dry valleys. The average thickness of the ice cap is 1.7 miles. And it has been, the maximum thickness that has been measured is 3 miles. So we're talking about an area that is a very extreme environment. And that makes it a really amazing place to visit, and it makes it a very challenging place to try to work and to try to conduct research. There are a lot of superlatives that are associated with Antarctica. It is the coldest, the windiest, the highest, and the driest continent. And interestingly enough, we actually didn't know very much about Antarctica until very recently in human history. And so I'm going to start off with the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. Just tell you a little bit about this because I think it's important to understand the history of the Antarctic and people to know why we got to where we are today. So it was actually hypothesized that Antarctica existed as far back as the 2nd century. In fact, that's when the name Antarctica first came up. But the first person that we know of to actually see the Antarctic was von Bellinghausen from Russia, and that was in 1820. And then another landmark in Antarctic history is 1911, when Amundsen from Norway was the first person to reach the South Pole. And some of you may know about Shackleton and his adventure with the Endurance. That occurred in 1915. So from the original sighting of Antarctica until about 1917, there were 10 countries that launched major expeditions to go to the Antarctic. And then after that, you have the 2 world wars. There were still expeditions going to Antarctica, but it wasn't until 1957-58 with the International Geophysical Year that Antarctica really sort of came into its own. And during the IGY, there were 67 countries that participated in the science. The focus here was on earth sciences. They had a number of different areas of earth sciences that they wanted people to look at. I've just listed a few of them here. They were interested in solar activity, aurora, magnetic fields. And during the IGY, there were 12 countries that conducted research in Antarctica. And this was done on a collaborative level. There was a lot of integration between the different national programs, national projects. And as a result of the IGY, the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, SCAR, was established. And it also, the IGY led to the formation of the Antarctic Treaty. So I'm going to talk about both of these because today, both SCAR and the Antarctic Treaty are very important in terms of the research that's done in the Antarctic and the way that Antarctica is protected in terms of its environment. So the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research is an interdisciplinary organization. It falls under the umbrella of the International Science Council. The membership of SCAR is made up of 32 countries and 9 of the ISC unions. And these are the members of SCAR that have a vote. And then there are 12 associate member countries. So as Susan mentioned, I'm the US delegate to SCAR. SCAR meets every 2 years. And it's during those 2-year meetings where we handle most of the business. But there's a lot of subcommittees and subgroups in SCAR that are working continually throughout the year. I put the website here. If you're at all interested in the details about SCAR, you can take a look at the website. So as I mentioned previously, it was the IGY that essentially stimulated the establishment of SCAR in 1958. And it was specifically to continue the kinds of international collaboration that had taken place in Antarctica during the IGY. So for the last 62 years, SCAR has had 2 areas of focus for its mission. And the first one is science leadership. And what SCAR does is it helps to facilitate international collaborations in Antarctic research. It helps to coordinate these efforts in both Antarctica and in the Southern Ocean. I need to say that SCAR does not sponsor research, so SCAR is not a research funding organization, but what SCAR does is it's a place where scientists from different countries can come together, they can talk about their research, and they can develop initiatives that are forward-looking, that are identifying the big new questions that are coming up in Antarctic science. And to give you an example, here's a list of the current scientific research programs that have been adopted by SCAR. And I'm not going to go through these individually, but you can take a look. The names are actually pretty descriptive of what they do. And you can see that they span the entire range of physical sciences, geosciences, biological sciences. And there's actually a lot of cross-cutting with these programs. So they include scientists from a lot of different disciplines. There are literally hundreds of scientists around the world that are involved with these scientific research programs. And the way that SCAR works, these scientific research programs come into being for about 6 to 8 years. And then they'll gradually be phased out and a new program will take its place. And the new programs are coming from scientists. So SCAR is really kind of a bottom-up organization. So scientists identify what the next new initiative should be. And then they will put together, groups of scientists will put together a proposal and bring it to the delegates. And then it will be voted on whether or not that's something that will be taken forward by SCAR. So science, facilitating scientific collaboration across national Antarctic programs is a major function of SCAR and a major focus of its mission. The other part of what SCAR does is provide scientific advice. And SCAR is a science advisor for the Antarctic Treaty System. So if the treaty system needs information in order to adopt a particular policy, they'll come to SCAR and ask for scientific advice. And if SCAR has recommendations, they can go to the treaty system and make a recommendation on policies that might be considered. There are other bodies that also turn to SCAR for advice, and one example is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So SCAR was established in 1958, and then the following year, the Antarctic Treaty was signed. And the same 12 countries that had conducted scientific research in Antarctica during the IGY are the ones that established the Antarctic Treaty. Currently, today in 2020, there are 29 full member countries of the Antarctic Treaty and 24 non-consultative parties. And those are the countries that are interested in the Antarctic Treaty, but they haven't reached the status yet where they can vote at the treaty meetings. The Antarctic Treaty is a really interesting cooperative agreement among nations. It's the first of the post-World War II arms limitation agreements. And it has several major aims. One of them is that it sets Antarctica aside as a demilitarized zone. It establishes Antarctica as a nuclear-free zone. And it is there to ensure that Antarctica is used for only peaceful purposes. And then the Antarctic Treaty also has a goal of promoting international scientific cooperation. So the Antarctic Treaty and SCAR work very closely together in this second point, promoting international scientific cooperation. In addition to the treaty itself, we refer to the Antarctic Treaty System, which includes the Antarctic Treaty. And then there are these other agreements that have been made between countries. So there's the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Seals, the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, and the Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty. And the protocol is implemented through a group called the Committee for Environmental Protection. So countries that are part of the Antarctic Treaty also have national representation on these three different groups, the two conventions and the protocol. And these groups meet regularly. They make decisions, they make recommendations to the treaty system, and they provide a lot of advice in terms of the various groups that you see here that they cover. The Committee for Environmental Protection meets every year alongside the Antarctic Treaty. And the protocol kind of reinforces a lot of things that are in the treaty itself. So it designates Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. The protocol through the Committee of Environmental Protection also sets up policies governing human activities in Antarctica. And this includes not only scientists and the logistic support, the people that go down and support science, but also tourism. And Antarctica has become a pretty big tourist destination. Last year, the number of tourists visiting Antarctica was 56,000, which is a lot more than the 4,000 scientists and support people that go down to do science. The protocol also prohibits mining in the Antarctic, so there's no economic profit that can be made. The only mineral resources that can be taken are ones that would be used for scientific research. And then the Committee on Environmental Protection also addresses a number of other issues like environmental impact assessment, management of waste, marine pollution. And these are things that are related to a lot of the activities associated with doing science, having research stations in the Antarctic, and also what happens when tourists visit Antarctica. So for example, if a country wants to put in a new research station in the Antarctic, they would submit a proposal to the, or they would submit for review to the Committee on Environmental Protection, what their plans are for doing that. So the environmental protection or management of the Antarctic at the international level is through the Antarctic Treaty System, the different groups that I just mentioned, and also the Council of Managers for National Antarctic Programs. And these are the people who run the logistics side of national Antarctic programs. And so they would be responsible for what happens at the different research stations. And so they also have a pretty big responsibility. They work very closely with the Antarctic Treaty System. They also work very closely with SCAR. So all three of those groups are in very close contact. In fact, at all of these meetings, there's always a representative from the other two groups. So there's a lot of good communication that goes on between the various organizations that I've just talked about. At the national level, organization can vary from country to country. So for the United States, the National Science Foundation is the manager of the US Antarctic Program, which was established in 1959, right after the IGY. We also have the Marine Mammal Act, which was instituted in 1972. And this actually governs the behavior of US citizens, no matter where you are in the world, you fall under the Marine Mammal Act. And this essentially regulates how you can interact with marine mammals. And then we also have the Antarctic Conservation Act, which was passed by Congress in 1978. So a little bit more about the US Antarctic Program. So this falls under the National Science Foundation, which has an Office of Polar Programs. And the Office of Polar Programs is divided up into the Arctic and the Antarctic. And on the Antarctic side, there's the Antarctic Infrastructure and Logistics Group, and there's the Antarctic Sciences section. The Infrastructure and Logistics Group, just as the name implies, they're responsible for all of the logistics in terms of getting people to the Antarctic, making sure that everything is there that's needed for science to be done, and then getting us all home again. The Antarctic Sciences section has a number of different science programs under it: astrophysics and geospace sciences, earth sciences, glaciology, integrated system sciences, ocean and atmospheric sciences, and organisms and ecosystems. And these are the programs that fund US Antarctic research. So all of the funding that I've gotten to go to the Antarctic has come through the Antarctic Sciences section, and mostly through organisms and ecosystems. There are other federal agencies that do research in the Antarctic. NASA, the USGS, US Geologic Survey, NOAA. And when they want to send projects down to the Antarctic, they coordinate with the National Science Foundation through the US Antarctic program to get the logistics that they need. For example, that big balloon that you see over on the right-hand side is a NASA project. So the Antarctic sciences span, again, just like SCAR, the whole breadth of the various science disciplines that you have in Antarctica. I wanted to show you the 3 permanent US bases. So we have McMurdo Station, which is on the Ross Ice Shelf, and the Amundsen-Scott Pole Station, which is at the geographic South Pole, and Palmer Station, which is on the Antarctic Peninsula. So these operate year-round. In addition, the US has 2 icebreakers, and I'll be showing you a picture of one of them on the next slide. And then there are also a lot of seasonal field camps. So people will go to a main base, like they can go to McMurdo, and then from McMurdo, they'll get deployed out to a camp that might exist for a couple weeks or a couple months. But these 3 are the permanent bases that are operated year-round. And people always ask me, how do you get there? So I decided I would put together this slide just to give you a sense of what it takes to get to the Antarctic. If you're going to go to Palmer Station, you would fly down to the southern end of Chile on a commercial airlines, and then you get on an icebreaker. And so this is a picture of the Nathaniel B. Palmer. The other icebreaker is the Lawrence M. Gould, and actually the Gould is the one that goes to Palmer Station more often. That trip across the Drake Passage takes, well, it should take about maybe 4 or 5 days, but it can take a lot longer depending on how much ice there is in the way. If you're going to go to McMurdo Station, then you fly to Christchurch. And then in Christchurch, you get on military aircraft. And here's just a few pictures to show you what those look like. I have most often gone down on the plane on the bottom left, which is a C-130, a Hercules aircraft. These have skis, they can land on the sea ice. The picture in the center there shows you what the cabin looks like. So not exactly United Airlines, not very comfortable, but it works. It gets us to where we want to be. And then on the lower right is a picture of a C-17, which is another plane that's used to take people back and forth. I've also flown out on C-141s, which are starlifters. So there's various ways to get to the Antarctic. The flights take a lot less time than the ship, but to be very honest, I would rather spend the time on the ship than in one of these planes, which is very uncomfortable. So I wanted to also give you a little bit of information about what I have done in Antarctica, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because there's other things I want to tell you. But my initial research in the Antarctic was around the issue of ozone depletion. And so here you're looking at a satellite image of what's commonly referred to as the Antarctic ozone hole. And this ozone depletion event was first discovered in the mid-1980s. And it didn't take very long for scientists to figure out what the chemical and physical aspects of the atmosphere were that made this event possible, and why it was such an extreme ozone depletion relative to what happens in other parts of the world. But then after that came questions about, well, if you have depletion of ozone, then you have increases in ultraviolet light. And so what does that mean for organisms living in Antarctica? And this is where I came in. I work with plankton, and I was very interested in learning how these increases in ultraviolet light might be affecting Antarctic phytoplankton. So here's a picture of an Antarctic diatom. This was taken under the microscope. That cell is approximately probably 10 or 20 microns in diameter. You can see the little green dots, those are the chloroplasts. Phytoplankton are very important. They're at the base of the food chain. Not only do they provide nutrition for other organisms in the ocean, but when they photosynthesize, they produce oxygen. And so about 50%, and probably much more than that, of the oxygen that we breathe from the atmosphere is coming from photosynthesis in the ocean from organisms like this. I was very interested in how the different species of phytoplankton are affected by ultraviolet light. And some of the work that I did was looking at DNA damage caused by UV exposure. So this little cartoon here shows a normal DNA molecule on the left, and then after it's absorbed ultraviolet light, you see it has a deformed shape on the right-hand side. the left molecule is the normal one. And this is the same kind of thing that happens in your skin when you go outside on a sunny day. Your skin cells absorb the ultraviolet light. If it reaches the DNA in the nucleus of those cells, the DNA gets damaged. And the damaged DNA doesn't function properly. And so you have enzymes in your cells that locate the damage and then repair it. And this is the same exact thing that happens with phytoplankton. And what we found was that the amount of damage that phytoplankton cells incur is actually related to their size. So there's a really interesting relationship between the size of cells and their ability to tolerate UV exposure. I was also very interested in what kinds of mechanisms organisms in the Antarctic might have to protect themselves from UV damage. And so this is an example of a compound in a class called mycosporine-like amino acids. And these are compounds that absorb ultraviolet light. And so they essentially act like sunscreens. If an organism has a lot of these compounds in its cells or tissues, then presumably it has some kind of sunscreening protection. And that may help it to minimize the amount of damage that occurs to DNA or to proteins. And so we actually did a pretty extensive survey of marine organisms, both algae and invertebrates in the area of Palmer Station. And we found that nearly 90% of the organisms actually contain these mycosporine-like amino acids. So that was a very interesting finding, and we did experiments, and so these two areas, the amount of DNA damage and the rate at which it gets repaired and the way that organisms can protect themselves is something that I have spent quite a bit of time on. But about 50% of the time when I go to the Antarctic is for a very different reason. As Susan mentioned, I'm the co-director for an NSF training program in Antarctic Biology. And this is a program that's set up specifically for early career scientists. And it's an international program. PhD students and postdocs who want to work in the Antarctic but have never been to Antarctica can apply. And then we take them to the Antarctic, either to McMurdo Station or Palmer Station, and we give them a chance to get out in the field, to do collections, to run experiments. And it gives them a lot of experience in what it's like to work in the Antarctic. Because trying to write a research proposal without knowing what it's like to work in that kind of an extreme environment is actually quite difficult. So we have, over the years, we've had over 270 participants from 142 institutions from around the world and 33 different nationalities of people that have participated. And a good number of these have actually gone on to develop their own Antarctic research programs in the countries where they come from. So this has been a really rewarding program to work with, and it's been a lot of fun to be involved in this kind of an endeavor. So if you go to the Antarctic and you look around, this is what you're going to see, mostly white. It's not like the organisms are jumping out to see you. Most of the life is in the oceans. And what terrestrial life there is restricted to areas where there isn't any ice, which is a very small percentage of the continent. So what I wanted to do next is just show you some pictures. I put together some collages. I want to show you ways we get around in the Antarctic. How do we travel? How do we collect samples? And then I'll show you some pictures of some of the organisms that I've seen when I've been down there. So here's a bunch of different ways in which I get around. Most of the work that I do is either on the sea ice or in the water. And so on the left-hand side, skis work really well, cross-country skis. We can ski out across the ice. If your equipment isn't very heavy, you can drag a sled behind you. We have access to a number of different track vehicles, so we can drive these out onto the ice. We use snowmobiles. So we can actually lug a lot of equipment out if we have a vehicle that can take us out there. On the right-hand side, you see there's an inflatable, a Zodiac. We do a lot of work out of these small boats. And then we also have the two icebreakers, which can take us pretty much anywhere in the Southern Ocean that we want to go and collect samples. For me, personally, one of the most exciting ways to travel around in the Antarctic is by helicopter. And this is a way that we can get out to the ice edge. So you see the map of Antarctica and you see the ice around it in the upper right. Depending upon the season, the distance of that ice edge away from a place, for example, McMurdo Station, could be anywhere from 5 to 80 or more miles. And so with a helicopter, we can fly out to the edge. And the ice edge is a really interesting place. There's a lot of biological activity. There's a lot of phytoplankton, a lot of krill, which means that there's a lot of penguins and seals and whales. And so we can go collect samples, we can make measurements of what's happening in the water column, and we can collect a lot of data about what's happening in this really dynamic area. We have a lot of different ways of collecting samples. So here again is just sort of a mix of photos. I do a lot of plankton net tows. That's what you see over in the upper left corner. We have divers that come down sometimes, and they can help us with deploying experiments underwater and also collecting samples from the benthic environment. We do a lot of drilling. As I said, I do a lot of work on the sea ice. So oftentimes we're out there drilling holes so that we can get through to the water column. We can do the plankton tows, or we can lower instruments and make measurements. We work off of the ships. So we really have a lot of resources available to us. And so if you come up with interesting questions for looking at something in the Antarctic, there's usually a way that you can get that work done. As I mentioned, I spend a lot of my time with making plankton tows. Usually we're using the samples for experiments, or we're analyzing them for various compounds. But for me, my favorite part of the plankton tow is taking a look at the sample under the microscope, especially when the organisms are still alive. And so here you see some of the things that have been collected in the plankton tows that we've made in the Antarctic. Across the top are phytoplankton. There's some diatoms, and then that thing with the three pointy ends on it is a dinoflagellate. Over on the far right is a tintinid. And then the large orange organism on the left is a pteropod. There's a crustacean there at the bottom, and then a planktonic polychaete in the lower right. There's a lot of diversity, and it always amazes me that there's so many different species in the Antarctic, because the seawater temperature is 28 degrees Fahrenheit. So that means it took quite a lot of effort, or I should say there took a lot of evolution and a lot of adaptations for organisms to be able to survive at those temperatures. You get the same level of diversity in the invertebrates. Here's a kind of a picture that has a lot of organisms in it. I don't think the entire bottom looks like this, but in this case, you can see sea urchins. In the middle, there are scallops. There's tube worms. That big yellow blob in the center is a tunicate. And then over to the right, that other yellow mass is an Antarctic sponge. So again, lots of diversity. At the lower left, you can see the arms of a brittle star. So these are organisms that have adapted to living at these really, really cold temperatures. And then everybody always asks about penguins. And I will tell you, my first trip to the Antarctic, I never saw a penguin, which was very disappointing, but I've made up for it since. So here are some pictures of penguins. We find chin straps and Adelie penguins, emperor penguins. And then along the peninsula, there are a number of other kinds of seabirds. So in the upper right, there's a giant petrel. In the middle, a blue-eyed shag. And that white bird in the bottom middle that looks like a chicken is a sheathbill. And then on the right is a South Polar skua. And then, of course, we have marine mammals. So Weddell seals, leopard seals, southern elephant seals. And then the pictures here show a humpback whale, and then the two images that show orcas. So even though I work on phytoplankton, and these organisms are not my experimental subjects, it's always fun to be out there and come in contact with these animals and be able to see how they live. It's also interesting that they're not afraid of people. The penguins especially will come right up and peck on your equipment because nothing out of the water eats them. So they're just not afraid of us. So it's a very different experience interacting with the wildlife there. So again, just to come back to this concept of Antarctica as being this very stark and sterile place, there's still a lot of biology there. As I said, most of it is in the water. And I think for many people, when you mention the Antarctic, it seems like a very remote and distant place. And people often ask, well, why should I care about Antarctica, and why is Antarctica important? So I'd like to spend the last few minutes of my presentation and kind of give some reasons why going to Antarctica and studying the Antarctic is important in terms of what goes on in the rest of the world. So for one thing, if you look at the location of the Southern Ocean, the South Pacific, the South Atlantic, and the southern part of the Indian Ocean all come together around the Southern Ocean. And you have the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, which is the world's largest and strongest ocean current that runs around the continent. And one of the things that happens in the Antarctic is that when you get sea ice forming on the Southern Ocean, it drives this process of thermohaline ocean circulation. So thermohaline refers to thermo for temperature and haline for salt. And essentially what happens is as seawater freezes, it's only the water molecules that come out of seawater and crystallize to form the solid ice. The salts get left behind. So as sea ice forms, the seawater under it gets denser and denser because it has higher and higher salt concentrations. And the water is very cold. So that very salty, cold water, which is very dense, now starts to drop. It descends down to the bottom. And when it gets to the bottom, it starts to move north. And so in this image, if you look at the loops here, the red and the blue represent cold water running along the bottom of the ocean. So you can see from the Antarctic, water is moving up into the Indian Ocean and up into the Pacific Ocean. And then at some point, when it gets very far north, it rises. And the red lines here represent warm water that's running along the surface. And the same sort of thing happens in the North Atlantic. Although there, the ice is forming in the Arctic, and that heavy, dense water that's left behind descends and starts running south. So if you take a look at these loops, you'll see that they are all connected. It's one big system. And this is referred to as the ocean conveyor belt. And the importance of this thermohaline circulation pattern is that it helps to distribute heat across the planet. And so it's a very important component of what happens with weather and climate in other places besides Antarctica. So understanding what's happening with these ocean currents and how these thermohaline density gradients form in Antarctica and up in the Arctic is very important in order for us to understand what's happening with the Earth system as a whole. Antarctica also has a lot of Earth's history preserved in its ice. So we have these, again, anywhere from 1 to 3 miles of ice, and we have the technology to core through that ice, and those ice cores can be analyzed. The graph that you see here on the right is from the Vostok ice core, and you can see that the temperature and CO2 concentration trends all match each other as you go through glacial and interglacial periods. So Antarctica can tell us a lot about the past climate history of Earth. And understanding what happened in the past is what scientists are using in order to predict what is going to happen or could happen in the future. So the ice cores are another important part of why studying Antarctica is a very significant endeavor. We also have a lot of ice in the Antarctic. 90% of the ice on the planet is in Antarctica, and 70% of the fresh water. And it's estimated that if all of that ice melted, it would rise sea level by 190 feet. And just to give you a sense of what that might mean, this is an image of Oracle Park drawn with a 25-foot rise in sea level. And I'm not going to really go into talking about sea level. I'm guessing that everybody who's listening to this knows about sea level rise and knows what the implications of that will be, especially for low-lying coastal areas. But a lot of that melting is going to come from the Antarctic. And then lastly, there's a lot of information that we've gained in the Antarctic by studying Antarctic organisms. So things about the physiology, the ecology, and the evolution of life on the planet have been elucidated by looking at things that have happened in the Antarctic and what organisms are doing there currently. So on the left, you see some picture of a fossil. There have been entire fossil beds of tropical rainforests found in the Antarctic. And so that has given us a lot of clues about what might have happened in terms of the evolution of life, and also what might have happened in terms of the movement of tectonic plates. And then in the middle, you see a picture of an Antarctic sponge. This has recently been discovered, and studies of this sponge have indicated that some of the compounds it contains have antimicrobial activity. So this is potentially a new source of antibiotics. And then the little fish at the bottom there is an Antarctic ice fish. And this is a pretty remarkable creature. It's living at 28 degrees Fahrenheit, but it hasn't turned into an ice cube. And the reason is that through the course of evolution, these fish have developed proteins which act as antifreeze. And so they have these antifreeze proteins that are coursing through their circulatory system, keeping their blood liquid. And so we're learning a lot about thermal adaptation and also evolution from studying these kinds of organisms. And on the right side, there's a picture of the Antarctic food web. And this is being studied not only to look at trophic dynamics, how energy gets transferred from one trophic level to the next, but it's also providing a lot of information about biogeochemical cycling, not only in the Antarctic, but also in other parts of the world. So there's a lot of things about Antarctica that we can relate to other areas of the planet. And so even though the Antarctic seems like this very cold and remote place, for many people very far away from where they live, there's a lot of things about the Antarctic that actually do affect us locally and affect our lives on practically a daily basis. So understanding what happens in the Antarctic relative to all the different aspects of its physical and biological systems is very important in order for us to understand what's happening around us. So I hope this has given you some new insights to the Antarctic. And as Susan said, if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat, and I'll be happy to try to answer whatever I can. So thanks very much for your attention, and I hope you have a good rest of the evening.
Deneb, that was just fascinating. Thank you. Wow. And we've got lots of really good questions. So Gail, you're going to be moderating all these.
Yes. All right, let's get started. Thank you so much, Deneb. Fabulous presentation. Such fascinating work that you're doing. Okay, our first question is related to the pandemic. We'd like to know, how is COVID-19 and the pandemic affecting research in the Antarctic?
So it's actually putting a pretty big dent into research. So all of the national Antarctic programs pulled everyone home. They left skeleton crews at the bases. In many cases, you can't really shut down a research station in the Antarctic. The effort and the energy and the money required to bring it back up again is sort of prohibitive. So they have got them down to very small crews. Science has been suspended for a while, but it will be starting up again. And I know the United States has a lot of protocols that they've put in place where people will be quarantined. If they're going down through South America or they're going through New Zealand, they will be quarantined before they get on a ship. Well, actually, they'll be quarantined on the ship, but they'll be quarantined at hotels in Christchurch before they're allowed to get on the plane. So there is going to be a definite impact in slowing down science in the Antarctic, because people are not going to be able to travel there, and the research groups are not going to be able to be as large as they have been in the past.
Okay, our next question is about NASA. We're wondering, what does NASA study in the Antarctic?
Well, the Antarctic is as close an analog as you're going to get for someplace like Mars. So NASA comes down, some of the instruments that they've sent into space, they bring to the Antarctic and test them in Antarctica to see how they work before they ship them off to a place like Mars, where they're going to be set off in a very extreme environment. Those big balloons are used to study the atmosphere. And so NASA has quite a large number of projects that they do in the Antarctic.
Great. Another question is, what is it like being on the ships when you're traveling to the Antarctic?
Well, I'm a person who loves being on a ship. So I actually really like it. The ships are pretty large. They're pretty comfortable. We have cabins. There's regular heads like you would have on any other ship. They have a lot of research space, so we can actually go in and reconfigure labs to fit whatever it is that we're doing on that particular cruise. The food is usually okay. And for me, I just like being on deck. And, you know, when you go down into the Antarctic, especially when you get close to the peninsula, it's really spectacular. And so being able to look at the scenery and see organisms that are going by is really something that I really very much enjoy. I'll go out on a ship anytime. So not a problem for me. For people who get seasick, crossing the Drake Passage is not a very pleasant experience. So I do know that going across from South America to the peninsula, that's considered to be some of the roughest ocean in the world. And I've been across where we literally were like tied down to chairs, and other times where it was like flat as a table. So it varies quite a bit depending on when you're going across. But for me, the ship experience is a great one.
Excellent. Thank you. Another question is about whether there are any concerns about any large predators on land. The person who asked the question said they couldn't think of anything themselves, but you know, aside from the occasional seal that might get protected if approached. Any predators?
No, the really, all the big animals are marine. And so we do come across seals that are up on the ice or they're up on land areas. In most cases, we don't, I mean, you give them pretty wide berth. We're not allowed to get close to them anyway, unless you have a permit and you're studying the seals. To be honest, the biggest fear for us are the leopard seals. So in my projects, I'm sometimes wading in the intertidal zone. I have divers that come down, and the leopard seals are the scariest things because they just pop up out of nowhere. If we have divers in the water, we usually have people stationed all around looking for leopard seals, and then we have a way of signaling people to get out of the water. But on land, there are no land. I think the biggest thing on land is probably some kind of a mite or a nematode.
Right. Okay. Switching gears here. So a question about the mycosporine-like amino acids. Can these potentially be applicable for human skin protection?
Yes, they could. And there's a group in Australia at the Australian Institute of Marine Science that had been doing quite a bit of research to try to see if these could be commercialized. And I haven't heard very much about that. They started on it quite a long time ago, and I just don't know where that research went. But that is something, they had patents out to try to see if they could use these as sunscreens for humans with the intent that they would be safer than some of the sunscreens that we have on the market now.
Interesting. And do you happen to know the warmest recorded temperature in Antarctica to date?
I know that on the Antarctic Peninsula, it can get above freezing. And recently, I think it's gotten up as warm as maybe, I'm going to guess, over 40 degrees Fahrenheit. But that's on the peninsula itself. When you're below the Antarctic Circle, it may have gotten that warm in the recent past, but off the top of my head, I don't know what the warmest temperature is.
Okay, thank you. And then a question about the thermohaline currents. Why do they move north after the dense cold water falls to the ocean floor?
That's a good question. I'm going to make a guess on this. If they're forming around the Antarctic, there's no place for them to go south. The continent is there. So the only place they can go is north. And then the same thing in the Arctic, if that cold water is dropping in the North Atlantic, it really can't move any farther north, and so it's going to be coming south. That's a guess.
Okay, interesting. Another person is interested in knowing, how many times have you been to Antarctica?
I have been to Antarctica 22 times.
Wow, impressive. Let's see, another question. Oh, so when tourists visit, where do they stay?
So that depends. Most of the tourists that go to the Antarctica go down on ships and they stay on the ships. And so a lot of that traffic comes from South America and the ships come down along the peninsula. And then there are also other tour companies that have camping. So people will come to the Antarctic and they'll be in tents. There is one place on King George Island at the tip of the peninsula where there is a small hotel. And so some tourists stay there. But they, yeah, I think I would say the large majority of tourists are on ships. And then the rest of them are camping out someplace.
Great. A question about your research. In your research, what is the impact of global warming on the numbers and concentrations of phytoplankton and other microorganisms in the seas around Antarctica? And how are those changes affecting the numbers and behavioral patterns of whales, seals, and other marine mammals? Big question.
That is the $50 million question. One of the problems we have is that there really hasn't been enough extensive research across wide areas of the Antarctic in order for us to have a really good picture of how the numbers have changed. So there's been a lot of studies that have been done. They're done in localized areas. Sometimes they might be long-term monitoring projects that happen in a particular bay or a particular part of the coastline, but we don't have a really comprehensive picture of what's going on around the continent. And so I honestly, I can't answer that question because we just don't have the database in order to make that kind of an evaluation.
Okay, thank you.
Not a very satisfactory answer, but sorry.
No, but it just demonstrates the importance of, you know, making research possible and continuing to do research so we learn more. And that there's so much that we don't know.
I do think that there might be a lot of progress being made on that now with satellite data, because they can actually measure the abundance of phytoplankton by looking at chlorophyll concentrations. So there may be some models out there that are in the process or have already looked at that. It's just not an area that I'm totally familiar with.
Interesting, great. Let's see, besides climate change, what are some of the other biggest challenges to Antarctica?
Well, I think for the oceans, there's a lot of interest in what's going to happen with ocean acidification, which actually is related to climate change. But I think most of the things that people are looking at now do have some link to changes in climate, because whether you're looking at glaciers or sea ice or biology, all of it's being affected by the fact that things are melting, that temperatures are increasing. So it'd be hard to come up. There's a lot of interesting questions in terms of space science. So there's a lot of research that's being done with telescopes and cosmic rays and trying to identify things that are happening in outer space. And so there's a place where Antarctica, the people are not studying Antarctica, but Antarctica is a great platform in which to do those kinds of studies in. So there's a lot of funding that goes into that. But I would say almost everything that we do in the Antarctic has some connection to what's happening with climate.
And I suppose you could also say that to a certain extent, the fishing that's going on there, like in the Ross Sea and other areas around the Antarctic, is kind of also related to climate change. But are you seeing any impacts related to fishing in like the Ross Sea and some of the other areas that arise during your research?
So not in my research, but that is something that the Convention on the Antarctic Marine Living Resources, that's what they focus on. So they're interested in looking at what's happening in different areas of the Antarctic that are used for fishing, and then setting out regulations that will help to protect those. And places like the Ross Sea, just recently the Ross Sea became a protected area. And so that took a lot of effort, but it got passed through everywhere. And so now there are a number of regulations in place that will help to protect that area from further impact.
Mm-hmm. Great. Let's see, other questions. We have a question about whether you've ever encountered a colossal squid, or at least ever seen the washed up body of one.
No, I wish I had. No, unfortunately, I have personally not ever come into contact with one of those, but I've seen the pictures and they look absolutely fantastic.
They do, they do. What about coral at the bottom of the Southern Ocean? Is there coral? How's it doing?
There are some corals. We're not talking reef corals like you find in the tropics, but there are some species of corals that you find in the Antarctic. And I don't know how they're doing. I'm assuming they're doing okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Back to tourism, are there concerns related to the rise in tourists and the footprints that they leave?
Yes. So in fact, a lot of the work for the Committee of Environmental Protection under the protocol, a lot of their work is related to tourists. And in fact, the tourists, the companies that take tourists to the Antarctic actually have their own organization. The International Antarctic Association of Tour Operators. And so they actually attend the treaty meetings, and they are very active in making sure that they follow all of the policies that are set out by the protocol. They've made changes on their own to make sure that the tourists they take down are not doing anything to affect the environment. But having that many people tramp through a penguin colony or go through an area where you have moss beds, it has an impact. And so the increase in tourism is a big concern for a lot of people. And as I said, the tour operators are working pretty closely with the Antarctic Treaty System to try to do whatever they can to make it as safe as possible.
Okay, tell us what it's like to be in the research stations. What kinds of extracurricular activities do scientists participate in? What is life like there?
So when I get asked that question, I usually answer by saying it's like going to summer camp on another planet. It's just a very weird social scene. The various research stations that the US has, they have a lot of, there's a lot of resources there. So if you have hobbies, there's usually a room that has a lot of hobby materials in it. Some people decide they're going to go to the Antarctic and learn how to play an instrument. So they'll bring a clarinet or a trombone with them. There's usually recreational equipment available. So if you want to go out for a hike, there's skis and snowshoes. There are bars at the stations. So there's a place where people can gather socially. If there's any kind of a holiday, there's always a party. So what I have found is that people who are at the stations, whether they're scientists or the support staff, everybody has a pretty good sense of where they are, that they're away from home, and everybody makes the effort to make it work. And so when it comes time for things like Thanksgiving and Christmas, the chefs go all out in terms of making sure that we have like a fantastic Thanksgiving dinner. They pull out the white tablecloths, that's the twice a year kind of thing. So it's a really interesting a place to be. As scientists, we're working a lot because it takes a lot to get down there. You don't have a lot of time. And so we work a lot. So when we get the chance to take a break, we're usually finding something fun to do.
Sounds great. Okay, a couple more questions. Let's see. Prior to COVID and the need for virtual meetings, where would the various international decision-making organizations meet? In New Zealand or Chile or there on Antarctica?
That's a great question. So for SCAR, the Scientific Committee for Antarctic Research, we meet twice a year. And the way that the location of our meetings is decided is that a member country will put in a proposal 2 or 4 years in advance. And they'll bring that to the delegates meeting. and they'll make a presentation. Here's why we should have the meeting. Like this last summer, our meeting was supposed to be in Hobart in Australia, and that had been decided 4 years before. And unfortunately, we didn't make it to Hobart, so that meeting was held online. In 2 years, the 2022 meeting is going to be in India, and that had been decided 4 years ago, or 2 years ago. So that's how the SCAR meetings are decided. The Antarctic Treaty meetings is very interesting. They actually go in alphabetical order of the countries that have signed the treaty. So you just started with A and you work your way through the alphabet.
Interesting.
We were supposed to be in Finland this year, but that didn't happen. And next year is supposed to be France.
Fascinating. Okay. Okay, switching gears a little bit. What dive certification do you need in order to dive there, and how thick are the dry suits that you need to wear?
Okay, so I don't dive, but I have taken divers with me, and they had to go through, so they had to have a certain number of hours in dry suits on their own, and then they actually had to go through a dive training program that is through the National Science Foundation, and it's held at Scripps, the University of San Diego, Scripps Institute of Oceanography. So there is an extra layer of training that you have to have before you can be certified to go down with an Antarctic team. In terms of the thickness of the dry suits, I don't know. I didn't realize dry suits had different thicknesses. I do know that when they go into the water, every single inch of skin except what shows above the face mask and right around the regulator is covered. So there's big mitts, and in fact we have to dress the divers because they can't get all that gear on by themselves. So they have boots that go on and get sealed to the suit, and then they have mitts that go on. They have these big rings on them, and you have to make sure that those are sealed. So it's not a trivial thing. It takes a lot of time to get them into the water, and then it's hard to get them out. Apparently, it's really incredibly beautiful down there, and so they go past. You know, we only have certain time limits during which they can be in the water, and so sometimes it's hard to get them to come out because they just like being in there.
Deneb, do you know Henry Kaiser by chance?
I don't know him, but I know the name. Yes.
Yeah. So he's a local musician, very talented guitarist, and also a big time diver. And I know he's been diving in Antarctica a good number of times, and he even did a video with his, and put his music to it.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if we can find that, but that might be fun to send out to the audience. Yeah.
Okay, and let's see, we have a couple more questions. At least one US government shutdown cost the scientists at least a year of lost data, if I recall correctly. One of our participants is saying, how is data collection going now with the anti-science agenda we've been facing for the last 4 years?
Yes, so good question. So yeah, the government shut down a couple years ago, went on long enough where they had to pull scientists out of the Antarctic. They suspended a lot of cruises. In fact, I have a friend of mine who was supposed to go on a cruise and it got canceled, and they're scheduled to go this coming April. And so it's just kind of wait and see what happens with the COVID-19 situation. But yes, there are going to be gaps in data. There are a lot of projects that have instruments in the Antarctic that are monitoring, and a lot of those are actually tended to by the support staff. So those data are still being continuously collected. It's the projects where scientists have to go down and collect samples where there's going to be a lot of issues. And I honestly just don't know the way around that. And in terms of the science budget, I do know that there's some concern about what happens in terms of this anti-science sentiment. But again, it's one of these wait and see situations. I think that this last year, NSF did get most of what they requested.
That's good. Good news. A little good news. We'll take it. Okay. On krill, do you happen to know the state of commercial krill fishing in Antarctica? I've heard this could be a problem for the animals that rely on krill, such as whales, but also other animals.
No, I'm sorry, that I don't know what the current state is.
Okay.
But I do know that krill fishing is probably the biggest fishing industry in the Antarctic.
Hmm.
And there has been, I've heard concern before about whether or not the krill fishery is taking food away from organisms that eat krill, but I honestly don't know enough about it to comment.
Okay. Quick question about tourists. Do you happen to know the average number of tourists that visit per year?
So last year, I know the exact number was 56,000 tourists.
Wow.
And that's almost double from the number of tourists that went down in the 2014, 2015 season. So there's been an increase in the number of tour operators going to the Antarctic, and there's been an increase in number of people wanting to go to Antarctica. So I expect, well, obviously the COVID situation has put a big dent in that as well. So I don't know what the future of Antarctic tourism is going to be, but it was escalating very rapidly.
Mm. And then kind of on the flip side, how many scientists and support staff typically occupy Antarctic at one time, generally?
So during the summer, so the height of the research season, I think the total number of scientists and support staff is somewhere around 4,000.
Okay. Another question for you. Let's see. Has the hawkish nature of the current US executive administration threatened the DMZ status of the continent within the last 4 years?
I don't think so. There really is no, the only military presence in the Antarctic are the planes that fly us down. At the US bases, we don't have, when I first started going to the Antarctic, there was a lot bigger military presence. For example, the Navy ran the galley and a lot of other things on station. They did the communications. And over the years, that's gradually been cut back and all of that's been taken over by private contractors. So for the US, we don't have military personnel on station except for the flight crews from the planes. Even the helicopters used to be operated by the Navy and now they're operated by private companies.
Interesting, okay. Let's see. In terms of staying there, what's the longest stretch of time that you've stayed there for on a single trip?
For me, it's a little over 5 months.
Mm-hmm.
Is the longest that I've stayed. And the time I stay down there is really related to the kind of project that I'm on. So sometimes we're there for 3 months or 4 months. And then at one time I was there for over 5 months.
Do you know who designs the facilities that are used for tourism and for research? Are there specialized architects?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if there's specialized architects, but there are certainly specialized there's a lot of things that have to be done when making structures. For example, we have a new South Pole station that was put in, well, new, probably about 10 or 15 years ago. And what happened was the original South Pole was a dome, was a geodesic dome, and it got completely snowed under. So the new station is up on these elevated pillars, so the snow can blow under it instead of piling on top of it. So there are a lot of considerations that have to be taken into account in designing stations. And if you go online and just look up the Antarctic stations, you'll see some really wild designs that people have come up with for future stations. And in fact, right now, McMurdo Station is undergoing a huge modernization. And so they're designing a lot of new types of structures for McMurdo. And again, there's just a lot of things that would need to be taken into consideration. And I expect that there are certain architects that would specialize in those kinds of buildings.
Interesting. Okay, a question regarding the cruise ships that tourists arrive on. One of the attendees says that they went to Antarctica on a 110 passenger ship, but believes that the largest tourist ships have about 4,000 or so passengers on board, which could be a gigantic disaster, both in terms of oil spills and the inability to rescue that many people if one of them went down. Has there been any effort to ban large cruise ships entirely from the area?
Not outright. I think at this point, I think a lot of that might be regulated by IATO, this tourist organization. I think that, again, they seem to be very, very careful about what they do in terms of bringing tourists to the Antarctic. So I think that might be the first place where there might be some kind of a regulation on how big a ship can come down. But I don't know if there's been anything more formal than that.
Okay. Question about the photo in your background, which is gorgeous. The participant is asking if you know how high those tables of ice are that we can see.
Okay, so I took this picture from a helicopter as we were flying over. So I honestly don't have a sense of how high. Those are actually icebergs that had floated into the harbor and then got frozen in place. So I don't know how high they are. It's really hard for me to tell in terms of the dimensions.
Okay.
They're probably like 50, 100 feet or more. They're not they're not short.
Right. Let's see. Are any of the private contractors who are there armed for defense purposes?
No. When I first started going down to the Antarctic, which was in the late 1980s, the stations did have rifles, but that was for protection against seals. And over the course of the years, those have all been taken out. So well, I take that back. They're at McMurdo, the station manager at McMurdo is actually a deputized sheriff, maybe. They have some legal status, and I don't know whether or not they have arms, but there are no visible arms around. And I know that at Palmer Station, there is nothing like that.
Okay. I think that I've gotten through all of the questions submitted in the chat. If I missed anyone, I do apologize. If anyone else has a question that they'd like to ask, please go ahead and send it over in the chat. Otherwise, I think we've got through all of them. Great questions. So thanks to everyone for being so engaged and participating.
They were great questions, and sorry for the ones I couldn't answer.
And one thing in contrast to meeting at the Bay Model, we don't have to scurry out. So we really kept you here, Deneb, and like Gail said, a lot of really great questions and spurred by really a fascinating firsthand look at such a remarkable place of Antarctica. So thank you.
There was one last question about how big a challenge are the seals, and you did talk a little bit about the leopard seals, but maybe they missed that comment. So do you care to comment about the challenges presented by the seals?
So the elephant seals and the Weddell seals are really not a problem. If they're up on land, we just give them a pretty wide range. The leopard seals are the ones that are really kind of scary because we work in the water. And there have been times like, we drill these holes in the ice in order to make collections. And if a leopard seal decides it wants to take over that hole that we made for breathing, we just abandon it because the seal will not let you get anywhere near that hole. So we try to avoid them as much as possible. And the biggest danger, as I said, was we do a lot of wading in the intertidal to collect samples, and I have divers in the water, and we really have to be careful that they come out if we see leopard seals in the area. Leopard seals, I know of several people that have gotten bitten by leopard seals, and I know in some of the old expeditions, people had actually gotten seriously injured by leopard seals. So it's not a trivial thing. And I think British Antarctic Survey had a scientist who was actually drowned by a leopard seal about 10 years ago. So we just don't go near them. We don't want anything to do with them.
Yeah, they are ferocious
Do you,
when they want to be.
there is, regarding the leopard seal, there is a really great story. You know, there's a great photographer,
Oh,
wildlife photographer.
yes, the National Geographic.
Exactly. And he
Yes.
got in the water to take photos. He said he was scared to death, but he developed a rapport with this leopard seal who actually tried to bring him a penguin, a dead penguin, thinking, yeah, here, you know, I'm going to give you some food. And it's just a really amazing story. But yeah, they're having come face to face with one when I was kayaking down there. It was that you can't imagine the size of the head. So yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. We did get one more question for you. You mentioned that there were 3 US bases on the continent. How many others are there from other countries? Are there other countries who have bases down there as well?
Yes, so all of the countries that are signatories of the Antarctic Treaty have bases in the Antarctic, and some of them have multiple ones. So I think the total number is somewhere around 40. And those are
Wow.
the year-round bases, and then there are the seasonal camps and some of the bases that are small and do get closed down for the winter.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Well, excellent questions. Thank
Yes,
you
thank
again.
you.